The argument started over something stupid. It always did. A forgotten errand, a misplaced bill, a dinner gone cold because he came home an hour late, but this time felt different. Ethan's voice was sharper, almost trembling with anger he'd been storing up for months. The living room lights were too bright, the clock too loud, the air thick with unspoken things. I stood by the counter, still holding the towel I'd used to dry my hands, when he suddenly turned toward me, his face flushed, his eyes dark and unfamiliar. "You're just a useless burden." The words hit like glass breaking against skin. For a moment, everything stopped: the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, even my heartbeat. I couldn't move. I stared at him, trying to understand if I'd heard right. He didn't take it back. He didn't even flinch. He just exhaled, like he'd finally freed himself from a weight. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I wanted to defend myself, to remind him of the nights I stayed awake, helping him with proposals, the mornings I made sure his coffee was the way he liked it. 2 sugars, no cream. But my throat locked. All I could feel was the cold spreading through my chest. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, then looked back at me, expression flat, already done with the conversation. "I can't keep doing this, Lena," he muttered, brushing past me. The door slammed, shaking the frame. Silence followed, heavy, final. I stood there, the towel still damp in my hand, realizing that in one sentence, he had turned me from partner to parasite. I wasn't sure which part hurt more, the words themselves, or how easily they had come to him, as if he had practiced them in his mind long before saying them aloud. The house was still vibrating from the door slam when I sank onto the kitchen floor. The smell of burnt food lingered in the air, a bitter reminder that dinner had gone untouched. A plate lay shattered near the doorway, a single piece glinting like a small blade under the light. I reached for it absently, then stopped, afraid I might cut myself, though part of me wondered if that would hurt less than what I felt inside. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The echo of his words kept looping in my mind, each replay sharper than the last. "You're just a useless burden." I whispered them aloud once, just to hear how they sounded coming from my own mouth. They didn't feel like words anymore. They felt like a verdict. For years, I had convinced myself that Ethan's temper was just stress, that his silences were exhaustion, that his distance was temporary. We'd promised each other forever, hadn't we? Forever wasn't supposed to sound like that. I looked around the room, the neat shelves, the vase of fading lilies he hadn't noticed in weeks, the framed photo from our first trip together. In the picture, we were both laughing. I tried to remember what that felt like. Laughter, without fear underneath it. My phone lit up once, his name on the screen, and then went dark again. No apology came, no message, just emptiness. I pressed my palms to my face, trying to breathe, but every inhale tasted like defeat. Maybe this wasn't the first time he'd said something cruel, but it was the first time I believed him. Somewhere deep down, I knew this was a breaking point, the kind that doesn't make noise at first. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and I realized the night had fallen completely. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, and turned off the kitchen light. The room sank into darkness, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alone. There was a time when Ethan's laughter filled every corner of our tiny apartment. Back then, we didn't have much hand-me-down furniture. A leaky faucet that sang in the night, and a second-hand couch we swore we'd replace when we made it. But we were happy, truly happy. We'd sit cross-legged on the floor, eating takeout straight from the cartons, planning the life we were going to build. He used to look at me like I was the future itself, something bright and solid he could hold on to. I can still remember the way his eyes softened when he talked about his dreams, the company he wanted to start, the places we'd travel, the home we'd one day buy. He'd promised me the world, and I believed him because in his arms, it didn't seem impossible. There was warmth then, not just in the room but in the air between us, a constant hum of belonging. We'd stay up late, talking about everything and nothing, our words blending into laughter until we fell asleep in each other's arms. I used to trace his face while he slept, wondering how I had gotten so lucky. I thought love would always feel like that, easy, safe, eternal. Somewhere between those nights and now, something shifted. The laughter faded first, replaced by long silences. Then came the sighs, the rolled eyes, the small cruelties disguised as jokes. I can't pinpoint the exact moment it changed. It was like a slow erosion, the kind you don't notice until you're standing on the edge of what used to be solid ground. When I look at him now, I see the same face, but it's as if someone switched the light off behind his eyes. And maybe behind mine too. The past feels like another life entirely, one that belonged to a different version of us, one that still believed love could fix everything. These days, mornings feel the same no matter what the calendar says. I wake before the sun, move through the house in silence, and prepare breakfast Ethan rarely touches. Coffee in his favorite mug. Toast cut just the way he likes. I still do it, out of habit more than hope. He barely looks at me when he leaves for work, always rushing, always somewhere else. When the door closes, the quiet becomes so heavy it feels alive. I spend the day cleaning rooms that don't need cleaning, folding clothes that no one notices, scrolling through old photos before deleting them one by one. I tell myself I'm keeping busy, but really, I'm just trying to fill the emptiness he left behind while still living here. The neighbors think we're the perfect couple. They see us wave from the driveway, smiling like actors in a picture-perfect life. "You two are such a lovely pair," Mrs. Hernandez said last week, handing me a basket of lemons from her garden. I smiled and thanked her, careful not to let the truth slip through my expression. They don't see the way Ethan's jaw tightens when I speak, or how he flinches if I reach for his hand. They don't hear the silence at dinner, or how he eats with his phone in one hand, scrolling through messages that aren't for me. Sometimes I walk past the mirror and catch my reflection, startled by how faded I look. Not old, just absent. As if I've been quietly disappearing, layer by layer, until what's left is only a shape that cooks, cleans, and smiles on cue. I used to think ghosts were trapped souls, bound to the places they died. Now I know they can live in broad daylight too, folding laundry, watering plants, pretending to still belong to someone who stopped seeing them long ago. Ethan thinks he knows everything about me. He thinks I'm predictable, the quiet wife who folds his shirts just right, who knows how he takes his coffee and when to leave him alone. He believes I'm the same woman who once followed him with blind devotion, who still waits by the window when he comes home late. But what he doesn't know could change everything. I've learned to keep my silence, to let him underestimate me. There's power in being unseen. He doesn't notice the way I study him now, the way I collect the little details he drops: carelessly new perfume on his collar, late-night texts, excuses that sound too rehearsed. I catalog them all, every inconsistency, every slip of the tongue. He doesn't know that behind the calm tone and steady eyes, something inside me has already shifted. The woman who once trembled at his anger is gone. What's left is someone quieter, but sharper. Someone who watches instead of pleads. He doesn't know about the documents locked in my desk drawer, or the savings account in my name alone, the one he never thought to ask about. He doesn't know that while he's been busy building his world without me, I've been carefully preparing for a life beyond him. Sometimes, when he talks about our future half-hearted plans for vacations we'll never take, promises that mean nothing, I just nod. I let him think I still believe. I let him feel safe in his ignorance. I've realized that the truth has its own timing. And when the moment comes, when everything falls into place, he'll finally see what he failed to notice all along. But until then, I wear my silence like armor. Let him think I'm still his shadow. Let him think he's won. He'll never see the truth coming, not until it's standing right in front of him. The phone rang just after noon. I almost didn't answer. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the pattern of sunlight on the floor, when the sound jolted me back into the moment. "Mrs. Cole?" The voice on the other end was gentle, cautious, in a way that instantly made my stomach twist. My doctor. I could tell by the tone that whatever she was about to say wasn't routine. She talked for a long time about tests, results, follow-ups, next steps. The words blurred together, a tide of medical terms I couldn't hold on to. I caught fragments. Irregularities. Urgent, Further evaluation. My fingers felt cold. I nodded even though she couldn't see me, whispering a small thank you before hanging up. I sat there for a while, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic outside. For a moment, I thought about calling Ethan, telling him. But then I pictured his face, the distracted look, the inevitable sigh, the way he'd glance at his phone halfway through the conversation. He'd probably tell me not to worry, then forget about it by dinner. He hadn't noticed my silences, my tiredness, the way I'd been holding my chest at night. Why start now? So I decided to keep it to myself. Maybe it was cowardice. Maybe it was self-preservation. Either way, I didn't owe him my fear. The truth was mine to carry, at least for now. I made an appointment for the following week and wrote it down in my planner, neat and small, a secret between me and the page. As I closed the book, I caught my reflection in the window, tired, pale, but still standing. Ethan thought he'd broken me, but he had no idea what was really happening inside me. He didn't realize that the woman he called a burden was now holding the kind of truth that could change everything. And one day soon, that truth would no longer be silent. When Ethan told me he was inviting his colleagues over for dinner, I felt that familiar knot tighten in my stomach. He said it so casually, like it was a simple get-together, but I knew what it meant. He wanted to show off the house, the food, the image of a perfect life. I spent the entire day preparing. The table was set with our best dishes, candles flickered softly, and the roast came out golden, exactly as he liked it. I even wore the dress he'd once called elegant but not too flashy. For a brief moment, I hoped maybe tonight would remind him of who we used to be. By 7, the doorbell rang, and his colleagues filled the house with laughter and chatter. Ethan's voice grew louder, brighter, the version of himself he saved for others. He called me sweetheart in front of them, touching my shoulder as though affection were still part of our vocabulary. But as the night wore on, and the wine glasses emptied, his tone shifted. He laughed a little too loud when one of them joked about demanding wives, and when I quietly reminded him to lower the oven heat, he smirked. "Lena worries too much," he said. "She's got all this free time at home, nothing better to do than fuss over little things." The group laughed politely. I smiled too, pretending it didn't sting. Later, when one of his colleagues asked if I worked, Ethan answered before I could. "She used to," he said lightly, "but she's not really the ambitious type." The room blurred for a second, and I focused on my glass, the faint reflection of my face trembling in the wine. I heard his words echo again, lazy, unambitious, and the same quiet tone I'd once mistaken for charm now felt like cruelty. I said nothing. I served dessert. I cleared the plates. I smiled when they left. But inside, something shifted. The hurt didn't break me this time. It hardened into something colder, sharper. I looked at him standing by the sink, scrolling through his phone, and I knew. I was done trying to fix what he kept breaking. My silence wasn't surrender anymore. It was the sound of me planning. The next morning, the house still smelled faintly of wine and roast. I moved through the kitchen quietly, washing glasses, wiping counters, trying not to think about the night before. Ethan had left early for work without a word, just a clatter of keys and the soft click of the door. I was wiping the dining table when his phone buzzed on the counter. He never forgot it. Not once. The sound startled me, sharp in the quiet morning. The screen lit up with a preview of a message. "Can't stop thinking about last night. You make it so hard to say goodbye." My chest tightened. For a moment, I told myself it had to be a mistake, a joke, a coworker, anything but what it looked like. But the words lingered on the screen, bright and intimate. I hesitated, then picked up the phone. The contact name was hidden behind a heart emoji. Another message appeared before I could breathe. "Next time, stay the night. I hate sneaking around." My hand shook, the phone heavy and alien in my palm. The last of my excuses dissolved. Every late meeting, every distracted glance, every new shirt he'd bought without reason, they all aligned like puzzle pieces forming the truth I'd refused to see. I set the phone down carefully, as though it might explode, and leaned against the counter. The floor felt unsteady beneath me. The hurt was sharp, but beneath it, There was something else, a strange, calm, almost relief. Finally, the uncertainty had a shape. The doubt that had been eating at me for months now had a name, a voice, a message punctuated with a heart. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I looked around the house he once called ours and realized it was already someone else's stage. The woman he'd called a burden was the one holding the truth now, and he didn't even know it. I deleted the messages, put the phone back exactly where he'd left it, and whispered to the empty room, "Not yet." Naomi showed up at my door 2 days later with coffee, and the kind of look that meant she already knew something was wrong. She's been my friend since college, sharp, loyal, impossible to lie to. She didn't bother with small talk. "You look awful," she said gently, setting the cups down. "What happened this time?" I wanted to say nothing. I wanted to keep pretending, to wear the same practiced smile I gave everyone else. But her eyes broke through the mask. I told her everything about the dinner, the words, the message. By the time I finished, my coffee had gone cold, untouched between my hands. Naomi leaned back in the chair, shaking her head. "Lena, he's not just disrespecting you anymore. He's destroying you." I stayed quiet. "You need to leave him," she said firmly. "You've stayed long enough. You don't owe him another chance." Her words hit hard because they were true, but truth doesn't always move you to action. "Not yet," I whispered. She frowned. "Why? What are you waiting for? He's cheating, lying, treating you like nothing. What more do you need?" I met her eyes and managed a small, tired smile. "Because if I leave now, he wins, and I'm not letting that happen." Naomi studied me for a long moment, as if seeing someone she didn't quite recognize. "You're planning something," she said finally. "Just be careful. Don't let revenge ruin you." I looked out the window where the rain had started to fall, thin lines tracing down the glass. "It's not revenge," I said softly. "It's justice." She sighed, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Then promise me one thing. Don't lose yourself trying to save what's already gone." I didn't answer. Because she didn't understand, this wasn't about saving him or the marriage anymore. It was about reclaiming the pieces of myself he thought he'd erased. And for that, I needed time. Just a little longer. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way Ethan always took his laptop to the bedroom at night. The calls he answered in the hallway. Voice low. Eyes flicking toward me like I was an inconvenience. I began keeping track dates, times, transactions that didn't add up. At first, it was curiosity. Then, it became a habit. I waited until he left for work one morning before opening his desk drawer. Inside were neatly stacked receipts and documents, but one folder caught my eye, an account summary under his company's name. I scanned the papers, heart pounding. Transfers. Large ones. Money moved quietly to another bank. Amounts that didn't match his salary. The dates lined up perfectly with his business trips. My stomach turned. I knew enough about his company to recognize he wasn't just hiding money, he was preparing for something. I moved on to his briefcase, where I found printed photos tucked between reports. A resort, palm trees, and him smiling, shirt unbuttoned, standing too close to a woman I didn't know. Her blonde hair caught the sunday. My fingers trembled as I flipped the photo over. A handwritten note, "Our secret escape." I sat there staring at the words, at the man in the picture who looked nothing like the one who called me a burden. He looked free, alive, like he'd already left me in his mind long ago. I could have screamed. I could have called Naomi, or confronted him, or broken something just to hear the sound. But I didn't. I gathered every photo, every document, and placed them carefully back where I found them. Because now I knew. He wasn't just betraying me, he was planning his exit. And if he thought he could discard me quietly, he'd miscalculated. He didn't realize I had already started building my own plan. One far quieter than his, but infinitely more dangerous. Before Ethan had an office with glass walls and a view of the city, he had a desk in our living room, an old wooden table we bought secondhand for $30. I remember the night he told me about his idea, his eyes bright with possibility. his words tumbling over each other in excitement. "It's risky," he'd said, "but if it works, it could change everything." And I believed him. I always did. Back then, I was a marketing strategist for a small agency. I knew how to build a brand, how to shape an idea into something people couldn't ignore. So, after my day job, I'd sit beside him, drafting proposals, designing logos, writing taglines. I built his presentations, edited his pitches, crafted his voice. We were partners in every sense, or at least that's what I thought. I remember the first big client he landed. He came home that night, lifted me off the floor, and spun me around. "We did it," he said. "We." That word used to mean something, but somewhere along the way, it disappeared. The company grew fast, too fast, and suddenly, I became invisible. When interviews came, he called it his vision. When success arrived, he credited his hard work. And me? I was just his supportive wife. He used my strategies, my words, my late nights, but I was written out of the story. I told myself it didn't matter, that as long as we were building a life together, the details didn't need to be equal. But watching him now, surrounded by the fruits of a dream I helped plant, I realized I wasn't his partner. I was his foundation, the one thing he stood on so he could look taller. And maybe that's why the fall I'm planning for him will hurt the way it should. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The kind of day that felt too ordinary to carry a moment that would change everything. Ethan had told me he was meeting a client downtown, one he'd been trying to close for weeks. Something in his tone set off a quiet alarm, so I followed him. Not immediately, just far enough behind to stay unseen. I told myself it was foolish, that I was above this kind of thing. But curiosity has a cruel sense of timing. I parked 2 streets away and watched as he exited his office, phone in hand, glancing around like a man with something to hide. He crossed the street, stopped in front of a cafe, and smiled. It was a smile I hadn't seen in years. Warm, unguarded, almost boyish. Then she appeared. Blonde hair, red coat, the same woman from the photo. She walked straight into his arms. No hesitation. He kissed her on the cheek, then whispered something that made her laugh softly. They looked natural together, like they'd done this countless times. I watched as they sat by the window, hands touching across the table, his attention completely hers. Not once did he glance at his phone. I waited, frozen behind the wheel, feeling the slow unraveling of something I'd been holding together with denial. The pain was there, yes, sharp and deep, but behind it, something colder was forming. Clarity. I didn't confront them. I didn't storm in or create a scene. Instead, I watched long enough to memorize the curve of her smile, the tilt of his head, the casual betrayal that no longer needed to hide. Then, I started the car and drove away. My hands were steady on the wheel, my face dry. There was no room for tears now. They would only blur my vision, and I needed to see clearly for what came next. Because love, I finally understood, had ended long ago. What remained was calculation. And he had just given me all the proof I needed. That night, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the dark window that reflected my own tired face back at me. The city lights blinked in the distance, indifferent to the chaos unraveling inside this house. Ethan was in his office down the hall, his voice low and cheerful as he talked to her, the same warmth he used to save only for me. I didn't cry this time. There were no tears left to give him. Something inside me had gone still, almost peaceful, like the silence before a storm. I realized I had been fighting for a version of us that no longer existed, clinging to memories that had already rotted. I thought of all the nights I'd waited for him, all the dinners that went cold, all the times I let his cruelty bruise me just to keep the peace. No more. I stood up and walked to the dresser, pulling out a small notebook, the one where I'd been writing down every detail, every bank transfer, every lie, every whispered call. I had enough now. Enough to unravel everything he'd built, piece by piece. I knew what I had to do, and the thought didn't scare me anymore. I was going to disappear, yes, but not like a victim fading into the shadows. I would leave behind a trail of truth sharp enough to cut through the perfect life he pretended to live. When I was gone, he'd finally see what it meant to lose the person who had silently held his world together. I packed a small bag that night, just the essentials. Clothes, my documents, the folder with everything I'd found. As I zipped it closed, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for him to change. I wasn't hoping. I was done. He thought he'd broken me beyond repair, but he'd only stripped me down to something stronger, something dangerous. When I finally left this house, I'd do it on my terms, and when he looked for me in the wreckage, he'd finally understand the cost of his cruelty. The day after I made my decision, my doctor called again. Her voice was lighter this time, almost relieved. She said there had been a mistake in my earlier test results, a false alarm. The word terminal no longer applied. The condition was serious, yes, but treatable, curable. I wasn't dying. Not yet. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. I just sat there, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the sunlight creeping across the floor. I should have cried from relief, but instead, a strange smile spread across my face. I thought of Ethan, how easily he dismissed me, how his words, "You're just a useless burden," had sunk into my bones. He still treated me like I was fading away, too weak to matter, too broken to fight back. He didn't know I'd just been handed time he didn't deserve to have with me. When I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long while, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the small, familiar sounds of a life that suddenly felt new. I ran my hand along the countertop, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingers. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. I wasn't a dying woman anymore. I was a woman reborn, carrying the truth like a hidden blade. Ethan came home late that night, smelling of expensive cologne and wine. He didn't even notice the faint smile on my lips when he walked past me. "Dinner?" he asked without looking up from his phone. "In the fridge," I said quietly. He grunted something that might have been thanks, and disappeared into his office. I watched him go, my heart steady, my pulse calm. He still thought I was shrinking, crumbling, fading. He didn't realize that I was standing taller than ever, that I had already begun to rewrite the ending he thought he controlled. And soon, he'd learn what it really meant to underestimate a woman who had nothing left to lose. The morning after the call, I walked into town with a scarf wrapped tight around my neck, the cool wind brushing my face like a quiet reminder that I was still here alive, thinking, planning. I stopped in front of an old law firm tucked between a bookstore and a cafe. It was a small place, nothing flashy, the kind of office where secrets could be whispered without echo. Inside, a young attorney named Mr. Delgado greeted me with a polite, cautious smile. I told him I needed help reviewing some old documents, company records, ownership agreements. My voice was calm, detached, as if I were discussing someone else's life. He asked a few questions, took notes, and after a moment, his eyebrows rose slightly. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "you own 20% of your husband's company. Were you aware of that?" I smiled faintly. "Yes," I said, "he isn't." For years, those shares had been buried in fine print, part of the early paperwork I'd helped file back, when Ethan's dream was still just an idea. He must have forgotten, or maybe he assumed I'd never think to look. But I had, and now I intended to use that mistake. Mr. Delgado helped me set up the process, quietly transferring assets, changing account authorizations, preparing contingencies in case Ethan tried to make a move before I did. Every form I signed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. When I walked out of that office, the sun was brighter, the air sharper. I wasn't running anymore. I was maneuvering. At home, I kept playing my part. Cooking dinner, smiling when he spoke, asking about his day as if I didn't know the truth. Inside, I was already rewriting our story. Every kindness I showed him now was a disguise. Every quiet moment, a move in a game he didn't know he was losing. Ethan had built his empire on my trust, my silence, my labor. Now, I would let him destroy it with his arrogance. I didn't need revenge. I only needed the truth and patience. the kind that cuts deeper than any scream ever could. Ethan started spending more nights away. Meetings, he'd say, or networking dinners. I nodded, always the understanding wife. I'd learned to hide my knowledge behind calm eyes and gentle smiles. I still wore the soft sweaters he liked, still asked if he wanted coffee before work. It was a performance I played flawlessly, and he never suspected. He believed the illusion because it suited him. To him, I was still fragile, sick, tired, irrelevant. That was exactly what I needed him to think. He grew careless in his cruelty. He'd sigh dramatically when I forgot something, roll his eyes when I asked about his day. Once, when I burned a pan by accident, he muttered under his breath, "Useless." I almost laughed. He didn't realize that while he was busy insulting me, I was already 3 steps ahead. Some nights, I'd sit at the kitchen table with my laptop open, pretending to scroll through recipes while actually checking account balances and corporate filings. He'd pass by without a glance. To him, I was harmless background noise. The invisible woman. I started noticing how easily he revealed himself when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Phone calls taken too close to home, half-truths said too casually. He was unraveling, and I was quietly collecting every thread. One evening, he came home drunk, stumbling through the doorway, smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. He slurred something about how lucky I was that he kept me around, that no one else would. I smiled as I guided him to the couch, nodding as if I agreed. Inside, the words no longer hurt, they just confirmed what I already knew. The man in front of me wasn't my husband anymore. He was my case study. I covered him with a blanket, turned off the light, and stood there watching him sleep. He looked peaceful, defenseless, unaware that the woman he'd reduced to nothing was quietly dismantling his life piece by piece. He thought I was weak. He thought I was dying. But the truth, his truth, was the one gasping for breath, even if he didn't know it yet. And when the moment came, he'd realize that every time he called me a burden, I was already building the weight that would finally crush him. It happened on a Thursday evening, the kind of night that smelled of rain and endings. Ethan came home later than usual, his tie loose, his face drawn tight with frustration. I could tell before he even opened his mouth that something or someone had gone wrong. He slammed his briefcase on the table, muttering about incompetence, about how no one respected him anymore. I stayed quiet, setting his dinner on the counter. I'd learned that silence was the safest language in our house. But that night, my stillness seemed to provoke him more. "Do you even hear me?" he barked, pacing the kitchen. "You just stand there like a statue. Do something useful for once." I looked at him calmly. "Dinner's ready," I said. He laughed bitterly. "Dinner? That's your contribution to this marriage? You think I come home to eat your overcooked food and pretend it matters?" I didn't flinch. I didn't apologize. I just watched him, really watched him the way you'd observe a stranger making a fool of himself. The more I stayed quiet, the angrier he got. Finally, he slammed his fist on the table and shouted it again, the phrase that had become his cruel refrain. "You're just a useless burden." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. But this time, something different happened. I smiled. Slowly, calmly, deliberately. It was small at first, almost unnoticeable, but when he saw it, he froze. His mouth twitched, unsure whether to speak again. The power shifted in that instant. My smile wasn't one of forgiveness, it was understanding. I knew exactly who he was now, and I knew exactly what I was doing. "What's funny?" he demanded. "Nothing," I said softly, tilting my head. "I just realized you keep repeating yourself. You must be running out of new insults." For a moment, he looked unsettled, like the ground beneath him had moved an inch. He mumbled something, grabbed his briefcase, and disappeared into his office, the door slamming behind him. I turned off the lights and stood in the dark kitchen, that small smile still curling at my lips. For years, his words had been my chains. Now, they were just noise background, static fading into silence. The burden he kept talking about wasn't me. It was his own guilt, and soon I'd make sure he finally carried it. After that night, I began working in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when even the house seemed to hold its breath. Ethan slept heavily after his late-night calls and whiskey, oblivious to the glow of my laptop from the corner of the room. I went through everything: emails, invoices, client contracts, and what I found was worse than I imagined. At first, it looked like simple carelessness, duplicate payments, vague vendor names. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. Ethan wasn't just cheating on me, he was cheating his own company. He'd been moving money into shell accounts, disguising it as consulting fees. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Some of the accounts traced back to his business trips, the ones that always lined up with weekends away with her. He was siphoning money to fund his affair, his trips, his life of deceit. Each discovery steadied me instead of breaking me. I saved everything: screenshots, statements, transfers, organizing them neatly in a folder labeled house repairs, an irony that made me almost laugh. Because soon, his entire empire would need repairing. I even found an email chain between him and his accountant, coded language about private arrangements and temporary reallocation. I forwarded it all to a secure drive, one only I could access. Every click of the mouse, every file I renamed, was another nail in the coffin of the man who thought I was powerless. He had built his success on arrogance, believing no one, especially not me, could ever catch him. But he forgot that I knew his business as well as he did. Better, even. By the time the clock hit 3, I leaned back in my chair, the faint hum of the computer filling the silence. On the desk beside me sat a printed stack of evidence thick enough to ruin him in a single afternoon. I traced my finger over the top page and whispered, "Useless burden, huh?" The words didn't sting anymore. They tasted sweet like justice. Ethan had always underestimated what silence could do. What he didn't realize was that while he'd been busy committing his crimes, I'd been quietly building the story that would end him. And when the time came, I'd let the truth speak louder than I ever needed to. It happened on a Monday morning, the kind of morning that looks ordinary until it isn't. The board meeting was scheduled at 9. Ethan had insisted I attend as a formality, a leftover habit from the days when he used to value my opinion, or at least wanted to look like he did. The conference room smelled of coffee and tension, the long table gleaming under the soft light. I sat near the end, quiet, invisible, as the men and women in suits chatted about quarterly growth and upcoming investments. Ethan looked confident, even smug, pacing in front of the projector as if the world still belonged to him. Then, someone's phone buzzed. Then, another. Within seconds, the air shifted. A murmur rippled through the room. One of the board members, a gray-haired man with glasses, cleared his throat and turned his laptop toward Ethan. "Care to explain this?" he said. Ethan's brow furrowed. "Explain what?" The man clicked open an email titled, "Urgent Financial Misconduct Evidence Attached." The sender, anonymous at protonmail.com. The attachments were all there: bank statements, transfer logs, correspondence, everything. I recognized every file. Ethan's face drained of color as he scrolled, his jaw tightening, his fingers twitching. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Fake. All of it." But the room had already changed. The people who used to laugh at his jokes now avoided his eyes. The sound of shifting papers and whispered side conversations filled the air. Panic started to bloom beneath his expensive suit. "Ethan," one of the women said gently, "these documents have timestamps, account numbers, some from your personal email. We'll need to contact legal immediately." He stammered, tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. "Someone's framing me," he said, glancing around the room, eyes wild, desperate. I watched him from across the table, my expression unreadable, my hands folded neatly in my lap. No one looked at me. No one thought to. I was just the quiet wife who sometimes tagged along, the one he had dismissed so easily. For a moment, his gaze flicked to mine. Just a second, but it was enough. Something in my eyes made him falter. He knew. Maybe not how, maybe not when, but he knew I was the ghost behind the email. I gave him a faint, polite smile and looked away. The meeting dissolved into chaos, voices overlapping, phones ringing, and as Ethan's empire began to crack from the inside out, I sat perfectly still, watching it fall brick by beautiful brick. That night, the house didn't feel like ours anymore. The walls carried the tension he'd brought home, thick and suffocating. Ethan stormed through the doorway, eyes bloodshot, tie undone, the mask of control finally slipping. "What did you do?" he hissed, slamming his briefcase on the counter. "What did you send them?" I didn't move. I was sitting on the couch, a cup of tea cooling in my hands. "I don't know what you mean," I said evenly. He laughed, sharp, cruel, panicked. "Don't play stupid with me, Lena. Those files, those accounts, no one could have known unless they had access to me. Unless it was you." He was pacing now, running his hands through his hair, words tumbling out like broken glass. "You think you've won? You think ruining me will make you whole again?" I looked at him quietly, taking in the man who had once promised me the world and given me ashes instead. His anger didn't scare me anymore. It just looked small. Finally, I set the cup down and stood. My voice was calm when I spoke, steady in a way his never was. "I didn't ruin you, Ethan. You did that all by yourself." He stopped. His breathing was heavy, ragged. "You think you're better than me?" he spat. I took a step closer, close enough for him to see that I wasn't shaking. "I built this life with you," I said softly. "You just destroyed it alone." The words landed like stones. He blinked, stunned, searching my face for weakness and finding none. "You won't get away with this," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I already have," I replied. He stared at me, speechless, the truth beginning to settle where denial used to live. For the first time in years, he looked powerless, like a man who had finally met the consequences of his own making. I walked past him toward the door, the sound of my footsteps steady and sure. Behind me he called my name, but I didn't look back. The woman he'd tried to bury was gone. In her place stood the one thing he could never destroy: the truth. In the weeks that followed, everything Ethan had built began to unravel. The news spread faster than I imagined, first whispers among his partners, then headlines on financial blogs, and finally full-blown coverage on business networks. Coal Industries under investigation for fraud. His investors pulled out almost overnight. Contracts were canceled. Accounts frozen. His phone, once a constant source of validation, became a weapon of panic, each vibration another bridge burning. I watched from a distance, detached but deliberate. Every call he made was a plea, every meeting a desperate attempt to salvage what was already ashes. The man who once strutted through life with arrogance now looked like a ghost in an expensive suit, pacing the ruins of his own empire. And the woman he'd risked everything for? She vanished. No texts, no calls, no sign of her at all. When the fire got too close, she ran. They always do. At home, Ethan moved through the days like someone drowning in shallow water, panicked, grasping, but too proud to admit he couldn't breathe. He barely spoke to me, except for muttered complaints about how unfair it all was, how he'd been set up. I didn't bother to argue. There was nothing left to say. I spent my last evening there packing. Not much, just clothes, my laptop, and the folder with the final copies of the documents that had brought him down. The house was silent, except for the sound of drawers closing and rain tapping against the windows. I walked through each room one last time, tracing the outlines of a life that no longer belonged to me. Before I left, I wrote a note and placed it on the kitchen counter, beneath the mug where he'd once called me a burden for leaving coffee stains. My handwriting was steady, simple. "You called me a burden. I was your foundation." I didn't wait for him to find it. I locked the door behind me, stepped into the rain, and didn't look back. The sound of thunder rolled through the distance as I drove away, a fitting soundtrack to the collapse of the man who once believed I'd never leave. He didn't know it yet, but everything he had lost, his company, his pride, his comfort, had crumbled not because of me, but because he never realized I was the one holding it all together. Until I wasn't. Ethan's downfall became public within days. The story spread like wildfire: fraud, embezzlement, internal betrayal. Everyone wanted a piece of his disgrace. The same journalists who once praised his innovative leadership now dissected his failure with hungry precision. His photo was everywhere: tired eyes, forced smile, headlines beneath it like open wounds. From visionary to villain. The fall of Ethan Cole. The investors sued. The board cut him out. His accounts were seized, his reputation shredded. The man who had once been invited to every gala, every private dinner, every polished circle of admiration, was suddenly radioactive. Invitations stopped coming. Calls went unanswered. Even his closest colleagues avoided him. I saw one article that quoted an unnamed source. He always thought he was the smartest person in the room. I couldn't help but agree. I didn't take pleasure in his humiliation. Not exactly. What I felt was quieter, something like closure, or maybe just the absence of pain. Watching him stumble through interviews, trying to spin a story that no one believed, I realized that justice doesn't always need fire or fury. Sometimes it looks like silence while the truth does its work. I moved into a small apartment across town. A modest space with sunlight in the mornings and peace at night. No shouting, no footsteps pacing the floor, no constant sense of walking on eggshells. Just air and quiet. I started sleeping again. I started breathing again. Once, I caught his name on the evening news while washing dishes. I turned up the volume just long enough to hear the anchor mention that his assets were under review, that the investigation had expanded. They showed him walking past a crowd of reporters, head down, avoiding the flashes. For a moment, I felt a pang of something, not pity exactly, but memory. Then I switched off the television and went back to my dishes. Some things, I decided, weren't worth holding anymore. He had called me a burden, but now the world knew the truth. Without me, the empire he'd built had no foundation. And like everything built on arrogance and lies, it fell the second I stepped away. Ethan found the letter 3 days after I left. It was sitting exactly where I'd placed it in the top drawer of his desk, the one he almost never opened himself. By then, the house was quiet, stripped of my things, stripped of warmth. He'd probably been searching for paperwork, a contract, something to distract him from the silence. But instead, he found the white envelope, sealed neatly, his name written across it in my steady handwriting. He hesitated before opening it. I can almost see it, the crease of his brow, the twitch of his jaw, the breath he held as if bracing for another blow. Inside, there was no anger, no accusation, just the truth. A single page folded twice. And the results from my doctor's visit, the ones that said non-terminal, the diagnosis he never cared to ask about, the one he'd used as another excuse to dismiss me, to treat me as fragile, disposable. My letter began simply, "Ethan, you thought I was dying. You treated me like I already had. But I wasn't sick, not the way you imagined. I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I couldn't fight back. Now I know. You showed me the truth, cold, unfiltered, final. I'm leaving that truth with you now. It's the only thing you ever gave me that felt real. Don't look for me. You won't find me. L." He must have read it a dozen times, the paper trembling between his fingers, his eyes darting over the words that would never change. I imagine him sitting there, surrounded by the ruins of his life, realizing that the woman he'd called a burden had outsmarted him at every turn. That I had left him not in rage, but in absolute clarity. The letter wasn't revenge, it was a mirror. One final reflection of the man he'd become, the one I'd once loved enough to lose myself for. Now all that was left for him was silence, the kind that echoed through every empty room he once claimed as his kingdom. And for me, somewhere far away, peace. Ethan tried to find me. Of course he did. Men like him always do, after the damage is done, after the silence becomes unbearable, after the audience stops clapping. He started with the obvious. My phone. Calls that went unanswered. Messages that piled up, unread. "Please, Lena. Just talk to me. We can fix this. I didn't mean it." When that didn't work, he turned to my family. My mother called to tell me he'd shown up at her door, unshaven and frantic. "He looks terrible," she said softly. "Like he hasn't slept in days." I told her not to tell him where I was. She hesitated, but she knew better. "You're really done this time," she whispered. "Yes," I said, "for good." He sent flowers next. Dozens of them. White lilies, the same ones from our wedding. No note, just the faint scent of something that used to mean love and now smelled like memory. I threw them away. He started showing up at places he thought I might go: the coffee shop near our old house, the park where I used to read. I knew because Naomi told me. She'd seen him once, pacing near the bench by the lake, phone in hand, face hollow. He looked lost, she said. Maybe he was, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The man he wanted forgiveness from no longer existed. I'd buried her long before I walked out of that house. His last message came late one night. I'm sorry, Lena. You were never a burden. Please, I just want to see you. I stared at the words for a long time, the screen glowing in the dark. Then I turned off my phone and set it aside. Some stories don't end with reconciliation. Some end with understanding and distance. Ethan had finally realized what I was all along. Not a burden, not a shadow, but the foundation he'd shattered with his own hands. And by the time he understood that, I was already gone. Somewhere he could never follow. It started with an article, just one. A headline tucked between celebrity scandals and politics. The inside story of Ethan Cole's collapse. I almost didn't click it almost. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. The journalist, a woman named Claire Henson, had done her homework. Line by line, she laid out the story with surgical precision. The embezzlement, the offshore accounts, the falsified contracts. Every secret Ethan thought he had buried was there, neatly arranged for the world to see. But the last section was the one that stopped me cold. It wasn't about his crimes. It was about the woman behind the silence. Sources close to the investigation confirmed that the whistleblower responsible for exposing the fraud was none other than Cole's wife, who had quietly collected evidence for months before leaving him. There it was, truth, stripped bare. No embellishment, no vengeance, just facts. I could almost hear his rage when he read it, the disbelief curdling into shame. Within hours, the story spread everywhere. Business channels called it one of the most shocking betrayals in corporate history. But the public didn't see it as betrayal. They saw a woman who had finally stood up against the man who'd built his success on lies and arrogance. The narrative shifted. He was no longer the visionary entrepreneur. He was the fraud. And I, the quiet wife he'd dismissed as weak, had become the symbol of everything he'd underestimated. Messages began pouring in, some from old colleagues who remembered how I used to help with early branding pitches. Others from strangers who simply wrote, "Thank you for reminding us we can walk away." For the first time in a long time, my name wasn't tied to his. It stood alone in print, without apology. I didn't crave recognition, but I felt something close to vindication. I hadn't just survived him. I'd exposed him, not with rage or spectacle, but with truth. I closed the article, exhaled slowly, and looked out the window of my new apartment. The city stretched wide before me, anonymous and full of promise. The storm was finally over, and the silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. The first morning in my new city smelled like rain and coffee. The streets were still wet, sunlight breaking through clouds, as if the sky itself had decided to start over. I rented a small apartment with creaky floors and tall windows that let in too much light. I liked it that way. It reminded me that I was still alive, still capable of choosing brightness after years of living in shadows. I started working again under my maiden name, Lena Hart. It felt strange at first, introducing myself without the weight of Cole attached to it. But with every signature, every new email, every fresh beginning, the name started to fit again. Like a coat I'd once loved and finally found after years of searching. I joined a small marketing firm downtown. Nothing glamorous, but honest work. My first project was for a local bookstore, helping them design a campaign to celebrate community readers. Late nights spent writing taglines and sketching ideas made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. I'd forgotten how much I loved creating, how much of me had been buried beneath compromise and control. Sometimes, I'd catch myself glancing at my reflection in cafe windows, same eyes, same smile, but lighter somehow. Free. The bitterness that once clung to every thought had started to fade, replaced by something gentler. Peace, maybe. I walked home through quiet streets that evening, the sound of the city settling around me. People passed by, lost in their own lives, and for the first time I didn't feel invisible. I felt present, whole. At home, I brewed a cup of tea and stood by the window as the sun dipped behind the skyline. The city glowed gold, humming with the energy of possibility. I thought of Ethan once, not with anger, but with detachment, as if remembering a dream that had already dissolved in daylight. He had tried to define me by his cruelty, but here, in this quiet corner of the world, I was defining myself again. Not as someone's wife, not as someone's burden, but simply as Lena, a woman who had walked through fire and come out unburned. It was late afternoon when I saw him again. I'd just left the office, the sky dipped in gold and soft gray, when a familiar voice called my name from across the street. I froze. It had been months long enough for his voice to fade in my memory, but hearing it again felt like a door opening to a room I'd already sealed shut. "Lena," he said again, breathless, almost desperate. I turned slowly. Ethan looked nothing like the man I'd once known. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by something rumpled and tired. His eyes were sunken, his posture slouched beneath the weight of everything he'd lost. "I just wanted to talk," he said, stepping closer. "Please." I didn't move. "You found me, now what?" He hesitated, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, "but I need you to know I'm sorry. For everything. I was angry. Stupid, I lost control. I lost you." His voice cracked on the last word. And for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I used to love. The one who once made me laugh. Who once made promises he almost believed. But that man was long gone. I let him speak. Let him empty his rehearsed apologies into the cold air. He talked about redemption, about rebuilding, about how he'd realized too late that I'd been right all along. His words spilled out like a confession to a priest who'd already closed the book. When he finally fell silent, waiting for absolution, I took a deep breath. "Ethan," I said quietly, "I don't hate you anymore." He looked up, surprised. Hope flickered in his eyes. "I just don't feel anything," I continued. "You taught me what I never want again, what love should never look like, what respect should never cost." Unquote. His face fell, the words hitting harder than any accusation could. "I've forgiven you," I added, "but forgiveness doesn't mean return." He nodded slowly, eyes glistening, and for a long moment, we stood there, two people connected only by what had already died. Then I turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the pavement, each step a quiet reminder that some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. A few months later, I sat in a small office, filled with the hum of computers and the soft chatter of voices. The walls were painted in warm tones, hopeful, inviting. A brass plaque on the door read, "The Heart Foundation." It had started as an idea, just a scribble in my notebook one quiet evening. I'd received my share of the settlement money from the sale of Ethan's remaining assets, and for a while, I didn't know what to do with it. It didn't feel like victory, it felt like blood money. Something born of pain and loss. So I decided to turn it into something else. Something that could help women who didn't yet know how strong they were. The foundation's mission was simple. Support victims of financial and emotional abuse, women whose stories sounded too much like mine once did. We offered counseling, legal aid, job placement, and most importantly, a chance to rebuild their lives without shame. I kept my involvement quiet. There were no press releases, no interviews. My name wasn't on the website. It wasn't about recognition, it was about restoration. Every time I walked through that office and saw a woman laughing again, or holding a new set of keys to her own apartment, I felt something inside me heal a little more. One afternoon, a young woman stopped me in the hallway. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Whoever started this place saved me." I smiled, keeping my secret, and simply replied, "Then it's doing what it was meant to do." Later that night, as I locked up the office, I looked at the city lights glowing through the windows. Once, I'd been a shadow in someone else's life. Now, I was a light in someone else's dark. I didn't need Ethan's name, or his legacy, or his apology. I had built something far more powerful, a quiet rebellion turned into hope. And maybe, in some small way, that was the truest form of revenge. Not destruction, but creation. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint had faded, the lawn had grown wild, and the windows reflected nothing but the quiet ache of what used to be. I stood in the driveway for a long moment, the keys cold in my hand, before finally walking up to the front door. It creaked when I opened it, the sound echoing through rooms that once held laughter, arguments, and everything in between. Dust floated through the sunlight like ghosts suspended in the air. The living room still smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. My footsteps were the only sound as I wandered through each room, touching the walls as if they might still remember us the good parts, before everything soured. The couch where we used to fall asleep watching movies was gone. So were the photos, the curtains, the little details that made it ours. What was left were outlines, shadows of furniture, faint marks where pictures once hung. I walked into the kitchen last. The same counter where I used to set his coffee. The same spot where he once called me a burden. The memory didn't hurt anymore. It just felt distant, like a story I'd read too many times to still feel its sting. From my pocket, I took out my wedding ring. I held it for a moment, turning it between my fingers. It was simple, no diamonds, no flash. Just a band that had once meant forever. I remembered slipping it on, believing in everything it promised. And now, standing here in the hollow of what that promise became, I finally felt ready to let it go. I set it on the windowsill, where the morning light touched it gently. For a moment, it gleamed a small circle of gold, catching one last bit of warmth, before fading back into silence. "I forgive you," I whispered, though he wasn't there to hear it. It wasn't for him anyway. It was for me. I turned and walked out of the house without looking back. The door clicked softly behind me, final and clean. The past stayed where it belonged, inside those walls, buried with the version of me that had once waited by that window. Outside, the air felt new, lighter, free. The sun was just beginning to rise as I reached the edge of the hill overlooking the city. The world below glowed in soft shades of gold and pink, the sky wide open, endless. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in the smell of dew, the quiet hum of morning, a beginning disguised as an ending. For so long I had believed his words, let them shape me into something small, useless, burden. They had echoed through my mind, carving out my confidence, my joy, my sense of worth. But standing there, watching the world wake up around me, I realized something simple and true. My husband said I was a useless burden, without realizing that I was the reason he ever stood tall. I had built him, believed in him, carried the weight of his ambition when he couldn't. I was never the burden. I was the foundation, the one thing he never saw, because he never thought to look down and notice what was holding him up. And when I finally stepped away, everything he stood on fell apart. The wind shifted, warm and soft against my face. I closed my eyes and smiled. Not the tight, polite smile I used to wear, but one that came from somewhere deeper, steadier. I didn't need revenge anymore. I didn't need recognition. I had peace. I walked forward, the sun rising higher behind me, painting the path in light. Each step felt lighter, stronger, like shedding the last remnants of who I used to be. By the time I reached the crest of the hill, the world was awake. The sky burned gold, the city alive with possibility. And in that light, I wasn't his wife, or his shadow, or his burden. I was Lena Hart, independent, reborn, and finally free. This story was intense. But this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.